Hi, this is Chris Young. Welcome to episode 23 of Contemplating Life. Last week I read for you my award-winning article, The Reunion. This week I'm going to talk about what happened after it appeared. Somewhere along the way, I got in touch again with Rose and told her I'd written a magazine article about the reunion that featured her prominently. After the magazine came out, I talked to her on the phone. She was extremely flattered by the things I said about her. I specifically remember she said, "Nobody ever described me that way." That was a bit embarrassing for me to think perhaps I'd been more flattering to her than her husband had ever been. She said she wanted to keep in touch and insisted we could still be good friends. I agreed to keep in contact, but I knew that I wouldn't. The reunion event had been very emotional for me. I wrote about it to get those emotions resolved and to put it all behind me. That was one of the reasons I was reluctant to go to the trouble of getting it published. Now that it was published, again, I wanted to put everything behind me. I knew if I stayed in contact with Rose, it would be just another way to revisit things that I needed to leave behind. The phone conversation we had after the magazine came out was the last I spoke with her. As I said 2 episodes ago, I later heard she had a baby, and many years later, Google searches told me when she died. I don't think I left anything unsaid between us, although we didn't exactly say goodbye forever. I'm at peace at least as much as possible. Occasionally, she appears in my dreams. In those dreams, I'm out somewhere shopping or doing something, and I run into her. Sometimes she's left her husband, and I try to restart our relationship, but it never goes anywhere. Sometimes in the dreams, I see her in a crowd. I try to talk to her, but I can never get there. She slips away. After the article came out, I got a note from the Gilson family. Their brother thanked me for remembering them so fondly. He said he didn't recall the events described to me by my teacher, Mr. Cole, about the events surrounding Leslie's passing. Like I said in an earlier episode, in some ways it doesn't matter if it was true or not. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. In the list of people who were not at the reunion, I mentioned a janitor named John Cementa. I described him as whereabouts unknown. He called me to say, "I'm right here," and then laughed a hearty laugh. He'd been at the reunion, and I didn't see him. Over the years, I've tried Facebook searches and Google searches for other people from Roberts with whom I've lost touch. I found an obituary for my buddy Estel. I also found one for Carl Nash. He was a guy that I mentioned that I'd run into several times over the years, and he always asked, "Aren't you dead yet?" That was his backhanded way of saying he was glad I was still alive and beat the odds. I think it's supremely ironic that I outlived him. He was married to a Roberts alum named Mary. I forget her maiden name now. They lived in the small town of Bargersville, about 30 miles south of here. Rose lived next door in the same duplex, and her husband was Carl's nephew. I mentioned a girl, Cheryl Fayette, whom I took to the senior prom. She'll get an entire episode devoted to her pretty soon. Music and Hope economics teacher Betty Atkins wrote me to say how flattered she was by the article. She said something to the effect that she was surprised when any of her students remembered her at all. She had no idea the impact she had on me and was grateful to hear my story. I heard from Mr. Cole. We had a nice conversation, and I mailed him the original unabridged version of the story. I think it was a bit shocking to him to see the things we had discussed appear in print. Still, he was very gracious and grateful. Years later, he was cleaning out some files and mailed me back that unabridged version of the story. It was a good thing he did because I'm not sure I have a copy of that version anymore. And during the podcast, I went looking for the one he sent me back and some other memorabilia, such as a poem that Nancy Gilson had written. I still haven't found either of them. If I do, I'll post it on the website and make mention of it here. A couple of issues after the reunion appeared in the magazine, they printed letters to the editor praising the article. My friends and family, of course, were quite proud of me. I also heard from some people I hadn't heard from in years. My former next-door neighbor, Sid, dropped by just to tell me how much he enjoyed the article. He said he felt privileged to know me. A guy named Fred, who was a good friend of my aunt and uncle, was deeply affected by the story. Fred had suffered severe burns on the side of his face and head when he was young. You can still see scars on the side of his face and his ear. He always wore a toupee to cover the scars on his head. My Aunt Jody told me that after he read the article, they were on vacation together, and while swimming, he took off his toupee, something she had never seen him do before. She told me she thought that after reading my story, he found the courage to show who he really was. One of the reasons the magazine was reluctant to publish my story was because they, quote, never publish anything written in first person. Editor Deborah Paul wrote a first-person article about her life every month. That's what made me think they'd be open to what I wrote. She wrote over 400 such personal reflections every month until her retirement in 2017. Anyway, after my first-person article appeared, they continued to publish other first-person pieces, although I suspect some of them may have been ghostwritten by staff members after interviewing the subject of the article. A few months later, I got a call from Ms. Paul telling me that we, emphasis on we, had won an award. An organization called the Community Service Council of Central Indiana annually presented its Casper Award. That stands for Community Appreciation in Public Enrichment and Relations. The CSC was an organization that did planning for social service activities in the city. They had a very prestigious board of directors consisting of politicians and business people who were the movers and shakers of the city. I seem to recall my mother and I attended one of their meetings as a part of our disability advocacy work. I don't think she actually served on the council itself. Maybe this was a subcommittee. My friend Muriel Lee, mother of Christopher Lee, who I spoke about a few episodes ago in my Tech Expo presentation, had previously received a Casper Award. Anyway, the CSC found 5 articles in Indianapolis Monthly Magazine that they thought were worthy of their prestigious award. Although they usually gave out 2 or 3 such awards each year, they didn't want to give 5 of them to one publication. They concluded that it was Ms. Paul's leadership as editor that produced these works, so they gave her the award. In some ways, it was shared between me, another freelance writer, and a couple of staff members for our recognition of our work. But in the end, the single award ended up hanging on the wall in Ms. Paul's office. I was invited to the luncheon where the award was presented. Photos were taken, applause given. It was a really nice affair, and my mom and I really enjoyed it because we knew many of the people involved in social service activities. A short time after that, I got another call that I had won an award. Emphasis on I, not we. The reunion had been awarded first place as Best Magazine Feature by the Society of Professional Journalists Sigma Delta Chi. The award was going to me for my article. Naturally, the magazine was proud, but this one was mine and mine alone. There was a fancy reception at the downtown Indianapolis Athletic Club. Cocktails were served. The room was packed full of journalists. I dressed up in my only suit and tie. Mom and Dad accompanied me, dressed in their best. Miss Paul and other people from the magazine were there. I asked one of them, "Are the people in this room the ones who voted for me?" He said, "Many of the members of the Journalist Society are here. It's their award. But technically, no, they didn't vote. So that there's no conflict of interest, we trade with other states. We send them our nominations, and they pick the winners. We get their nominated stories, and we vote on them. I think this year we traded with Iowa." The guest speaker for the evening was independent presidential candidate Lenora Fulani of the New Alliance Party. Her 1988 presidential campaign made her the first woman and the first African American to appear on the ballot in all 50 states. She earned approximately 0.2% of the national vote. However, that was more votes than any woman until Jill Stein of the Green Party of the United States in 2012. After her stump speech in front of the gathered journalists, they opened the floor to questions. After 3 or 4 questions asked by journalists in the audience, I decided to ask her one. After all, in a couple of minutes, I would be an award-winning journalist. That year, Reverend Jesse Jackson was running for the Democrat nomination, and although no one thought he had much of a chance, the field was still wide open after the Gary Hart scandal. Jackson certainly had a better chance than this independent candidate that few people ever heard of. I don't recall if I had Mom or Dad raise their hand on my behalf or I had them raise my hand, but at any rate, I got called on. I asked her if Reverend Jackson would receive the Democrat Party nomination. Would you consider accepting an invitation from him to be his vice presidential running mate? I thought it was a brilliant question, and it may have been my imagination, but I thought I saw smiles from some of the journalists on the dais. In typical political form, she sort of dodged the question, saying she was focusing on her campaign, yet she wished Reverend Jackson well. In addition to the magazine awards, there were also newspaper and TV radio awards given. In my category, Best Magazine Feature, there were first, second, and third place awards, of which I got first. I beat out a couple of big stories. The presenter, I don't recall who it was, gave a 2 or 3 sentence description of the winning stories. One of the stories I beat was a feature about Ryan White. He was an Indiana high school student who came to national attention after his struggle to continue to attend school after he contracted AIDS. He had hemophilia and had contracted the disease through blood products. He was a real celebrity who attracted the attention of other celebrities such as Michael Jackson and Elton John. His story was one of the biggest stories in the state that year. It got a lot of national attention. The other story was about a military plane that crashed into a Ramada Inn hotel near the Indianapolis airport. That was also a major national news story. I never had the opportunity to read the other 2 award-winning feature stories. However, given the enormity and emotional impacts those stories must have had, I'm amazed and flattered that my simple memoir of a class reunion came out on top. I took home a very nice engraved brass plaque that's been on my wall for years. Well, actually, I took it down the last time we painted it. I haven't had a chance to put back up again, but I very much treasure it. You can see a photo of the award in the YouTube version of this podcast. I took some photos of the day of the award, and I'll also include them, but they turned out very fuzzy. I think they needed flash, and the exposure was too long. The magazine also published a sidebar piece about me and muscular dystrophy. At the time, I had not yet been diagnosed as having SMA. The piece quotes local MD researcher Dr. Charles Bonsett, but much of what he says, while accurate about Duchenne muscular dystrophy, doesn't apply to me because that's not what I have. While the reunion contains some outdated language, such as using handicap instead of disability, the sidebar, written by the magazine staff writer, is full of language that today would be considered blatantly ableist. The title of the piece is Life Sentence, with the subtitle, Muscular Dystrophy's Slow, Steady Progression Disables the Body, but not the Mind. The opening paragraph reads, for a lifelong neuromuscular disease sufferer, Chris Young, muscular dystrophy is a silent predator. Your muscles are its prey, he says. You feel weak, but you learn to cope. Then one day something sudden happens that you can't move anymore. MD is a terrible disease because you can't fight it. You just have to adjust. By today's standards, that is wall-to-wall cringeworthy. I don't doubt that they quoted me accurately, but I certainly would not describe my condition that way today, even though it's technically accurate. The piece is ripe with terrible language such as Young suffers from and MD plagues approximately 1,000 Hoosiers. I should note that the entire tone of my article is much more melancholy than I am today. Recall that the article started out as an extension of my personal journal. It was only reluctantly that I shared it with a few online friends in an obscure section of CompuServe, and even more reluctantly that I allowed it to be published at all. Writing it was a catharsis that let me put much of that melancholy and negativity behind me. A few years ago, I posted that sidebar on my blog, and I've included a link in the description here. Speaking of archaic language, I described a meeting we had in Miss Atkins' room as a rap session. That doesn't mean we were spitting rhymes to a beat. In those days, a rap session was just a gathering where people would sit around and talk about what was troubling them. As I said in an earlier episode of this podcast, language evolves, and it depends on context and consensus. The phrase rap session has a vastly different meaning now than what it did in the 1980s. As I reread the piece for the first time in years, preparing for this podcast, I suddenly realized they had cut, or I had cut, one of my favorite passages. And it was definitely my mom's favorite passage. The article said that some people saw my mother as a woman who thought Robert's school wasn't good enough for her son. I believe I followed up that story where one of the staff members, I think it might have been the school nurse, admitted to my mom that mom was right all along and that mainstreaming was a better way to implement special education. I concluded that story with a one-sentence paragraph that simply stated, Mom had a good time at the reunion, too. Mom's reaction when she read that sentence was to laugh out loud and say, hell yes, I did. That was a triumph for her. That sort of one-sentence, blunt understatement, such as, Mom had a good time at the reunion, too, is a recurring feature of my writing style. I can't believe I never noticed it was cut. I really needed to find that unabridged version of the story. That sentence became a kind of Tamarian shorthand between my mom and me for any gross understatement. I made reference in the story to various super crippled people, such as FDR, Stevie Wonder, and that girl from the other side of the mountain. That's a reference to a 1975 film of that name about Olympic hopeful downhill skier Jill Kinmont, who had a spinal cord injury just before the 1956 Olympics. It left her paralyzed from the shoulders down. By the way, my favorite scene from that film was when she was visited by her former boyfriend, and she was celebrating a great accomplishment in her recovery. She tries to pick up a potato chip out of a bowl of chips. She manages to get one trapped between her thumb and palm, but spilled about half of the bowl in the process. She was so happy she could do it. He looks at her like, "What the fuck? I thought you were getting better." He actually says,
"Aren't you gonna walk?"
Walk?
Yeah, I thought you were...
No. I'm never gonna walk.
he dumped her right after that. She goes on to find happiness with another man. Anyway, that wraps up all of the historical references you might not have gotten. The article concludes with the idea that I miss being a pioneer, like Northwest High School's mascot, the Space Pioneer. I enumerated 3 things that I intended to do. First was I was going to continue to do computer programming, especially in applications for disabled people. To be honest, I didn't do much of that for the next several decades. But in the last decade or so, I have heavily focused my efforts in assistive technology. Second, I said I was going to continue to keep my options open regarding relationships with women and not presume that parts of my life were closed. Although I never did find that one special someone with whom I could spend the rest of my life, I did have some very fulfilling relationships with women, including finally losing my virginity at age 35 in an intense friends with benefits relationship. Not being a kiss and tell kind of person, I can't say for sure how much of that story you'll get to hear in future episodes. Third, I said that the reaction to my article made me believe that I had talent as a writer. I implied that I was going to write my autobiography. I did write a book a few years later, but it was a computer programming book about an open source computer graphics rendering project I worked on. I've done extensive blogging over the years and gotten very positive feedback about that. However, the closest thing I've written to an autobiography is this podcast. Let's be honest here. I call this podcast Contemplating Life, and I try to keep it as generic as possible. But it's really contemplating my life. If I called it the autobiography of Chris Young, even fewer people would listen or watch. And it's not exclusively my biography. I wanted the freedom to go off on other tangents, such as my Oscar movie reviews. At some point, I'll dig into politics, or whatever other topics move me. I could have turned these reflections into a book, and even self-published if I had to. Being a writer is arrogant. You believe you have something worthwhile to say, and that people will enjoy reading it. I just wasn't convinced that my entire life story was worth the pain and effort to write the whole thing. But I do believe I have some interesting stories to tell, and that's why I do the podcast, to tell these stories about my life and talk about other things besides my own life when I feel like doing so. So it isn't exclusively contemplating my life, even though that's a big part of it, as you've already seen. If you find this podcast educational, entertaining, enlightening, or even inspiring, consider sponsoring me on Patreon for just $5 per month. You'll get early access to the podcast and any other benefits I might come up with down the road. I don't do the podcast for money, but finances are pretty tight. I'm not desperate, but a little extra income sure could help. As always, many thanks to my Patreon supporters. Your support means more to me than I could possibly express. It's not so much the money as it is that you care enough about what I'm doing to support it. Even if you can't provide financial support, please post links and share this podcast on social media so I can grow my audience. I've got over 200 Facebook friends, and only a handful have ever reposted or shared my links. I'll see you next week as we continue contemplating life. Until then, fly safe, everyone.